Sam, what is the Suez Canal?
Yeah, well, what is the Suez Canal? It's a canal in Suez between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. That's the basic thing. But what is it at a deeper level? It is one of the most important transport infrastructural phenomena of the modern world. It can be almost claimed to be one of the constitutive infrastructural projects of modernity. It was built originally to facilitate transport between, obviously, Europe and Asia, most specifically between India, which was at that time a colony of the UK. So between India and the UK. So it was of huge importance when it was built in the 1860s and 70s for the UK specifically, but for all European imperial powers.
But it was planned by a Frenchman, right, from the beginning?
Yes, Lesseps. My French is horrible, but I think his name is Lesseps or Lessepe. Yeah, it was planned by a Frenchman, but on behalf of the Egyptian government. It's also a very important part of the history, the imperial history of the Middle East, because it started out as part of an infrastructural drive, basically by the newly semi-independent parts of the Ottoman Empire. Similar things happened in Tunisia, for example, and also the Ottoman central government made similar infrastructural schemes and invested huge amounts of money in these kind of schemes in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. So it started out as kind of a part of a modernization drive, but it ended up being basically the end of independence of these countries. In practice, because it was built by Egyptian labor, it was in principle funded by Egyptian or organized by the Egyptian government, but it was paid for by European capital, which would loan to the Egyptian government at insane interest rates and under very, very weird conditions. So the original plan was that the European capital would finance this scheme, and then it would end up being owned by the Egyptians. But even before it was finished, it was actually in principle owned, in practice, it was owned by European powers, especially the British and the French. So this is a huge part of the discussion around the Suez Canal was it actually like a part of the modernization of Egypt, or was it part of the subjugation of Egypt, so to speak? At the time, the ruler of Egypt was Ismail Pasha, the Khedive of Egypt, and he planned for this to be kind of the last or the major step in making Egypt properly independent and self-sufficient, but it ended up being his downfall. In 1879, he was deposed by the British and French because he couldn't pay the bills officially.
I guess this is a kind of a forever question, but could you foresee a situation where this infrastructural project, which was, it wasn't necessarily imposed on the Egyptian monarchy at the time, but but so there was some kind of partnership, at least at the outset. But could you imagine a situation where this would be more beneficial to Egypt than it was, because it ended up, as you said, more or less subjugating Egypt?
I think yes. I mean, I think it was part of the lack of business acumen on part of the Khedives. Was just they were really bad at business. Basically, they were fooled by unscrupulous businessmen. But also, they got caught in a situation where they had given these concessions, supposedly with pretty decent calculations, being like, this is going to benefit us in 5 years or in 7 years or in 10 years, and then just kept being pushed back, I mean, we have the same situation in Mexico in the 80s, or in, Africa in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. I think it's this it's a thoroughgoing historical phenomenon where third world countries they enter into partnerships because at the outset it seems very lucrative, but then the deals they are striking are actually not very good for them, basically. But then, in the end, they ended up also paying off, an insane amount of money to European powers, giving concessions, which in no way kind of matches the amount of money they borrowed. So it was also just basically fraud on part of
a huge ripoff. Mm-hmm. So this leads to, in 1882, the British officially occupying Egypt. In the past, it was more of a kind of sort of soft subjugation. From 1882, there's an official occupation. There are British soldiers in Egypt, and this leads up to Egyptian nationalist movements growing stronger and stronger, in large part to sort of kick the British out. And the Suez Canal and the city of Suez, that whole region of Suez, becomes a flashpoint in these nationalist struggles and the sort of counter of colonialism, of British colonialism. What happens in the early decades of the 20th century?
I mean, just to start out saying, like, you say that it was officially occupied. I don't think it was ever an official occupation. It was all based on treaties, basically, where the British set out saying, like, oh, we have to manage your state finances because you can't do it yourselves. And we have to manage your state finances to be able to get our money back.
Right.
And yet that kind of grows into an occupation. And as you said, obviously it's imperialism. Obviously it's an occupation, but it's very vague for a long time. But then in 1919, you have the first Egyptian revolution, they usually call it, which is when they actually like rise up against the British and they try to claim independence. And they get some kind of 10 years independence going from 1919. And then there's a lot of different movements within that. And as you said, Ismailia and Port Said and all these cities around the Suez Canal are very central to every phase in the Egyptian independence struggle since basically Arabi, the original revolt in 1882, which leads to the British takeover. But then obviously we end up, if we have 1882 as the starting point of British occupation of Egypt, you have 1956 as the end point, which is when Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president dictator of Egypt, nationalizes the Suez Canal.
And what does that mean practically when you say that he nationalized the Suez Canal? What does that mean, and why is it so detrimental to imperial or European powers?
For several reasons, and I think it's important to point out this is on several levels. I mean, it's a historical shift. One part is obviously the Suez Canal still today, it brings in lots of money. I mean, the amount of tolls you get paid for having ships pass through there is a lot of money. So it's still been called by some people like the oil of Egypt, right? It's the land rent that Egypt has because Egypt has no big oil reserves. So in that sense, it's an economically important thing, but it's also militarily and strategically extremely important because while by 1956, obviously the British have lost control of India, it's still perceived by the British and the French as an important geostrategical power nexus. They need that to be able to move swiftly from Asia to Europe with their navies, etc., and with transport of raw materials, etc. So it's important in both of these respects. And so when they take over power in 1956, it's from this Suez Canal Company, which is run mostly by French and the English capitalists, backed by their governments, of course. And this brings Nasser into a head-on confrontation with the Western powers, basically. And then obviously to an Egyptian at the time, or an Arab, any Arab, it was also symbolically extremely important.
Yeah.
Because it marked the end, so to speak, or it signaled the end of the occupation that had started 70 years earlier.
So what happens when Gamal Abdel Nasser decides to nationalize the Suez Canal?
Well, this is one of the seminal events of modern Middle Eastern history, the Suez Crisis of 1956. We will have to get back to this in a specific episode, I think. But what happens is basically the French and the English and the Israelis conspire to move in. And officially they move in to, as you always do if you're a Western power, to safeguard the lives of civilians and to do a humanitarian intervention to safeguard trade and democracy, etc. So that's where they start off from. But what actually happens is they just move in with a lot of military force. And the Israelis are very much involved in this because they're also scared because they feel that they're dependent on the idea that Egypt is weak and Egypt has no proper control of the Sinai Peninsula and the Canal area. But then something very, very unexpected happens. The French and the English and the Israelis occupy the area. They fight, of course, with Egyptian army and Egyptian militias and popular uprisings, which they killed thousands of people. But it ends up failing miserably because the Soviet Union and the US agree to move in and stop it. This is something that's kind of unfathomable, I think, to us today. The US playing a somewhat anti-imperialist role. So basically, it's the Russians and the Americans agree that we cannot let this stand. We can't let the French and the English and the Israelis just do whatever they want in the Middle East. We need to have some kind of, international law, some kind of structure. Okay, they might, get some deal where they get paid back some money for the Suez Canal or something like that, but we can't have them just invade countries however they want,
And so the Suez crisis, which is known in Egypt as the tripartite aggression because of the three countries involved, France, the UK, and Israel, this ends up being, because of the American and the Soviet intervention, this ends up being a huge win for Gamal Abdel Nasser. This is essentially when he becomes the leader of the Arab world.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can't exaggerate how much that means. He moves from being like, there's a lot of dictators or semi-dictators or somewhat democratically popular presidents around the Middle East at the time. But the fact that he actually moves in against the British and the French and the Israelis and he wins, even though he doesn't win militarily, he wins because he plays the diplomatic field very well, ends up making him like the hero of the man on the street, in every Arab country.
Yeah.
And you have to remember this time it's still, North Africa is still under French occupation. And many countries around the Middle East, Jordan and Iraq specifically, still have a very, very close ties to the UK. They're semi-independent, but they're still perceived by their population to be semi-colonies. So Nasser basically shows like we can take the next step and become actually independent, and we can resist the imperial powers, and we can win. I don't think any Arab has any pretense of thinking that Nasser won this as a war. Everyone knows he won this by playing his cards, really well, but doesn't make it less important. Important to note at this time, a couple of years before when the US becomes the major enemy. Most Arab countries are not pro-US, but they're mostly anti the UK and the French, who are still the occupying powers. The US is seen as something more aloof. There's some communists who already see that the US is moving in to be like the hegemonic imperial power, but it's still perceived like the US and the Russians are like the friends of the Arabs because they defend their sovereignty. And it's very hard to see today, with the American, basically how the Americans are behaving around the world. But at this point in time, they were very much the guardians, or tried to be the guardians of some kind of international rule of law. But still in Vietnam, for example, you have the same situation in Vietnam where the French are seen as the aggressors, while the Americans moved in to be like, let's have some kind of agreement here,
Yeah. That is
years later, it ends up them being the imperial power, of course.
So we're running out of time, but can we say something about what the Suez Canal maybe means today to Egypt? And also, if you could say something about how exactly it's being affected by the Houthi blockade.
I think important to start with is just pointing out we live in this age where people talk about digitalization and the internet and everything is being digital and whatever. But if you look at the brute facts on the ground, to global capitalism, transport of huge amounts of raw materials and huge amounts of produce from different parts of the world is still the central function of trade. It's very, very important to capitalism. And the Suez Canal is extremely important. That it's more used today than it's ever been before, and it keeps growing. So in that sense, it's not a past age where the Suez Canal was important. It's still as important today as it was back then. Talking about the history as well, as we all know, President Sisi, the current dictator of Egypt, he started in 2013 this project to build the second Suez Canal. As someone who knows the history of the region and history of Egypt, is kind of almost like laughable how much he tries to model himself on Nasser, even though he's nothing like him. So he started building this kind of bypass, which is an important kind of infrastructural development of the Suez Canal. But if you were in Egypt around 2014, 2016, this was posters all over the country, being like the second Suez Canal, we're doing it again. And they and these beautiful posters with pictures of these huge boats going through and saying like the second Suez Canal, the gift of Egypt to the world. And it's like they're trying to prop up. He was very much trying to prop out kind of his position, which was very tenable at the time. Not a very
Still
popular ruler, not a friend of the pod, I suppose. So it's the ideological or symbolic importance of the Suez Canal is still living today. It's still something that politicians use to symbolize like we can do great stuff just like they did then. Nostalgia for the importance of the Suez Canal, even though it is, as I said, still economically hugely important. But then we have of course, the interesting fact of what happened with the Suez Canal since 7th of October. We all know that the Houthis, or the North Yemeni government, which I think it is basically to be understood as such, started this unofficial blockade of the Suez Canal, of the Red Sea, a month in, I think, of the Israeli attack on Gaza. And since then, there's been these repeated attempts by the US and the Western powers to stop them from doing that. They're basically attacking boats and taking over ships, trying to run through the Suez Canal. And it's failed so far to stop them from doing that. It's not succeeded at all, as far as I can see, even though you keep seeing news of attacks on the Houthi basis, etc. But what I've seen, the last digits I saw was the usage of the Suez Canal is down by 2/3 from before before 7th of October, before the Houthi blockade. And remembering what I said before, that it's still one of the central nodes of trade and the economy, the global economy, I think that is something we need to keep in mind. This is, whatever you think about the Houthis, I mean, obviously very problematic movement in many ways, but they've been doing the only effective resistance from the global community, so to speak. This is a huge blow against the global economy, and the fact that you don't hear much about it is probably because it is a huge blow. They don't talk about it. So 2/3 down, and I think the number of ships sailing around the Cape of Good Hope around South Africa is up by 60%. So basically, all the trade is now going around Africa again, as if this was the 18th century.
Vasco da Gama.
Exactly. Which is, it says something about how much you can do with very small resources and how deeply, dependent the global economy is still on this little tiny node.
We've gone way over time, but I think it's worth it because this is a huge topic. Thank you so much, Sam. This has been a Kalam Shorts about the Suez Canal.
Thank you.